So now we're moving on to what happens if you have a relationship that is not peer related. So it's going to be mixed status. Basically, a mixed status relationship is going to be one where the person is either above you or they're going to be below you. So those are the two criteria that we're looking at for this particular one. And certainly you can have situations where these evolve into friendships. I certainly have had those in my life. I still have some friends that were bosses for me in the past. Or I'm trying to think if have friendships with anyone I was a boss of. Not that I can think of. Not that I can think of. So yeah. So that might be something that might be ongoing, but I think the biggest thing is what's happening in the environment, not necessarily that they become your friends later on. And this is more about how those relationships show up. And I think a lot of times people are concerned, if you do develop a friendship, what's going to happen to that person's performance, or are you going to be able to give them feedback? Things like that end up being a little bit more of a challenge. Let's take a look at managing up. Let's look at just communicating with subordinates, so communicating to those above you, communicating with those below you, and then just some steps that you might take to maintain those relationships. So if you're communicating with someone above you, upward type of communication, that is a subordinate to a superior. And one of the ideas is that this relates to advocacy. I mentioned before in the last section that oftentimes communication in the workplace doesn't flow up. It mostly flows down. And the decisions are made, and then you're just told how you're going to relate to people, and this is the way it's going to be, and there isn't necessarily a lot of opportunity for information to go the other direction. Managing up suggests that you are sending information up, and so that relates to advocacy, and advocacy is kind of standing up for yourself, making sure your voice is heard, those kinds of elements as far as how it works with relationships. So some principles that kind of go with this idea of managing up is, first of all, when you're going to go do that, you want to plan what you're going to say in advance. I kind of do that anyway. Like, I'm always going to kind of think through the conversation, maybe how I might approach it based on who the person is. We talked about encoding and decoding messages. So how do I encode the message in a way that's going to kind of hit that person in the most logical way first? So I'm going to plan out how I'm going to give them that information. Then the next thing I want to think about is, why should they agree with me? So I need to kind of figure out what support I have for my ideas. What do I think are the best ways to kind of sell my idea to them? And so if they're kind of already leaning in that direction, then it's not such a hard sell. But if they're not, maybe you're kind of presenting something that might be a different way of thinking about it. So orient your message towards the person. So tailor your message, orient your message towards the person that you're speaking with. Figure out what you think is going to be most important to them. How might I say this again in a way that's going to make sense? Do they have a certain situation or experience that they've dealt with in the past that this might relate to or this might resolve? And how can I approach this in a way that's going to help make that make sense? I'm going to make sure I'm using language that's going to make sense to them. I'm not going to talk over their head by using language that is too complex, because sometimes your supervisor does, or they don't know what your field is or your idea. Sometimes they do, and they're completely entrenched in it. So if they know the language, then you can use that language. If they don't know that language, then you need to make sure you understand that and present something in a way that they can understand it. Don't embarrass them. If they don't know what you're talking about, that's embarrassing to them. So that's probably not going to help you sell your case. Create connections with people in advance. So maybe if you have a friend in the company, or somebody else, you might get them to agree with your idea, and then it's not just you saying it, it's you and these other people. Of course, get their permission to say that first. Don't just say it. make sure it's okay with them to say it as well. And then, figure out how you're going to say it, and say it in a clear and concise way, as the clearer and most concise way as possible. Now, how do you talk to people that are below you? So how do you talk to people that are what they call subordinates? So downward communication, how does information flow down? The first thing you want to keep in mind is making sure that you're kind of saying, hey, communication's important here, and I want to make sure that we leave this kind of open. So maybe even encourage them to, talk back. I remember when I was working as a trainer, we kind of didn't want to have them talk back to us because things were kind of not a very pleasant environment for them. And so it really, for them to give us feedback, there wasn't much we could do about it. And so they would just vent, and it wasn't a very beneficial thing. So in our situation, it's kind of like you almost had to be a cheerleader and just go rah, 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 and let's just keep going, versus creating open communication, where if I were their supervisor directly, then I would make sure that I would try to do what I could to make sure information flowed both directions. Listen empathetically. Don't go in there with a judgment already in your head. Just really listen and connect with the person as much as possible. Make things be a request rather than a statement or a expectation. Be polite with people. It's respect is just helpful all the way around. So just being respectful to people, and whether they're above you or below you, is just a smart thing to do. Be sensitive to people's feelings. Present things in a way that you can do it in a kind way. We're talking about maybe about behaviors, what people do in the workplace versus who they are as people. So maybe keep that focus on the specific behaviors maybe that they didn't do. And then share relevant information with the employees whenever possible. So if you know something's going to happen, something's changing in the organization, help them be ahead of the game, help them know what's happening with that communication so that they can be prepared, if something's shifting. There's a lot of scariness and trepidation if there's a takeover in the company, or if there's layoffs happening in the company and things have been announced, or some people have been laid off and everybody else starts to get a little scared. So, just be honest and say, hey, I'm not sure what's happening, but I'll let you know when I hear it. Those are helpful things to kind of state. Then at least people are prepared. There's another section which is complimenting and criticizing. So the thing about compliments is I think people have always thought, yes, I'm going to compliment them in front of other people. It actually can cause some issues within a group of people if you spend a bunch of time complimenting one person or kind of focusing on one, then they end up looking like a favorite, and that can cause them issues down the road. So maybe not do that. So maybe not do things in public, do those things in private, and keep the focus on work-related behaviors. So not necessarily how the person looks that day, but specifically what they did behavior-wise that you appreciated. And when you go to give feedback, be open and be as positive as you can. Like, start with the positive stuff. Focus on what they did well or what they did right. I try to do this when I give feedback, when I do speeches. So I try to start with something that they did well. And it's hard. It's hard because in my particular case, I'm not giving the feedback privately. But unfortunately, in our situation, students have an opportunity to learn from the other students, so I don't do that. But in a work environment, I would do that. So when I would have to talk to my agents, I would call them to the side and I would speak with them individually and separate from everybody else so that no one else heard it. I've actually had somebody yell at me when I was working in a restaurant, and they yelled, like I said, I can't even remember. I think I mentioned this one before. I can't remember even what they were saying or what I did wrong. All I remember that was them yelling at me in front of customers and how unprofessional that looked. It looked really stupid. And just to give basic information. Just give them what they need to hear. Don't go on and on. Don't drone on and on about the specific issue that there was. Just state it so they know that they need to correct it and move on. I also had a boss that didn't tell me there was anything wrong with what I was doing until later. Like, he didn't give me any feedback, none. And then wrote me up this big, long thing about all the things that I was doing incorrectly. Also not cool. So, yeah. I think he just handed it to me. I don't even think he discussed it with me. I think he handed me the letter with all the things that I was doing wrong, and I don't even remember him talking to me. I remember sitting in front of him, but I don't remember him talking to me about it. So just really, I guess I thought of him as being a coward, because I think that you can do it, but you don't have to be mean about it. So giving feedback doesn't have to be like a horrible thing. Maintaining mixed relationships, just a couple of suggestions here would be maybe to kind of create rules about how you're going to communicate. So maybe you have work rules, and maybe if you're going to have a friendship outside of that, what that might look like. And keep communication consistent and reliable. I would say keep consistent and reliable communication with everybody that's part of the group, so that everybody has the same information all across the board. All right, thank you.